The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome to the Race IndyCar Podcast. We've got a busy episode coming up for you. We've had the debut of the hybrid unit in IndyCar at Mid-Ohio, so we'll obviously wrap up everything that happened at Mid-Ohio. We've also got a special guest dropping in. The race winner himself, Pato Ward, is going to join us, talk about all sorts of different topics, not just Mid-Ohio. He's going to talk a little bit about his championship, how it's gone. He's going to talk a little bit to JR about how Tony Kanaan's impacted the team, and also a little bit on maybe where McLaren are lacking compared to Ganassi and Alex Palou especially, but just maybe in general where they're lacking a bit. The Mid-Ohio race, obviously before we bring Pato in, we'll just explain kind of what happened. Obviously a really close, actually the closest pole fight in the history of the Fast 6 format, 0.0024 seconds between Palou and Pato, but it was Palou who got the pole. He led away and looked very, very good at the start on the hard tyre, and at that point it looked very, very unlikely that anyone was going to be able to beat him. Pulled out a 6-second gap in that first stint, but then they switched to the softs and Pato was quicker. He erased a gap of around 4.5 seconds after the pit stop. He just looked much better, much more comfortable on those softer tyres than Alex Palou did. And then the last stint was probably looking like a bit of a worry for Pato, because he knew he had to go to those hard tyres again, and he must have known at that point that Alex Palou would be the favourite because he'd been so much better in the first stint on the hards. But in actual fact, a very uncharacteristic kind of problem in the pits for Alex Palou cost him a bit of time, and Pato said that he came through turn 13 and he said, "I've got his ass," because he could see that Palou's pit stop had gone badly and that he was going to be able to overtake him on the exit. And then he spent the better part of the next 25 laps fending off arguably IndyCar's best driver at the moment, and it was pretty cool to see, even though actually in terms of just like summing up the event, not a lot happened in those last 25 laps because the guys were just stuck together. It was still pretty cool to see Pato being put under pressure for the whole of that period by the most informed person in IndyCar and being able to hold him off. I think a lot of people probably expected that Alex Palou would have gone past at some point and wasn't quite able to do that. Also had the introduction of the hybrid unit, obviously, but JR, Hildebrand and I are going to get into that shortly. First of all, we'll head over and we'll chat to Pato O'Ward. Pato O'Ward, welcome back to the Race IndyCar Podcast. Nice to have you back under very happy circumstances after last weekend's win. I guess I'm kind of interested. You've kind of got a day, maybe not a full day, but a little bit of time here to think about the weekend and how everything's gone. And I guess you spent so long last year being asked questions about finishing second, and the team did as well. And there was all of this kind of, when is Pato's next win going to be? When is McLaren's next win going to be? How is that kind of, does it feel like a pressure's been lifted, or are you purely just enjoying the fact that you've won an IndyCar race and there's no reason to kind of think any more deeply about it than that?
It definitely feels like there's been a certain weight off of our shoulders, just because of, like, man, it was set. I saw yesterday someone did a Twitter post, and it was 714 days since my last on-track win, and it's a long time, man. It's a lot of races. I mean, and like you put so much into this, and then to come close, like I would say a solid 10 times, I would say, in the last 700 and whatever days. It's really nice to, like, whew, okay, because we won St. Pete, but we got the points. We didn't get to celebrate. We didn't really get to feel what that win is, and that is very special when you win a race. That's what ultimately makes you feel like you won something. So it was really nice to do it here, because I feel like I hadn't had a Mid-Ohio where it was like, that was a really good Mid-Ohio for me, because I always either, I've had a pole there before, very close this past weekend, but we had an engine issue, which we had to retire. And then last year I spun in qualifying after having a very fast car. So I was just like, I just want to start at the front and, like, have a chance, and I was determined to go into the weekend, like, let's make it happen. And after practice too, I told the team, this is the best car you've given me all year. Like, I will execute. And we did in qualifying. We were super, super close. And then in the race, I just knew I couldn't put a foot wrong if we wanted to beat the 10 car, because it's extremely strong team with a very strong driver. So you know that you gotta be on it.
I guess, like, that's a good segue into one of the questions that I have, which is just, you guys did have their number this past weekend. And I'm curious, do you feel like that's something that you guys do have on a consistent basis and just need to, like, pull it all together? Or do you think that there's still a bit of a gap there that needs to be closed? And if that's the case, like, what makes up that gap?
I would say this past weekend was the first weekend where you don't feel like you have to make some, or you have to, like, rely on something to help you, or to, like, make the impossible happen. Like this weekend, it just felt like, since the first practice, like, it just felt like, oh, I've got a good car. Maybe it's not the absolute best one, but it is one of those. And I mean, you know how it is. It's just one of those cars where you're like, I can work with this. I could really extract the maximum out of this without feeling like you've got a knife up to your throat. And we've really struggled this year. Obviously the tire has changed, and then it was a lighter car, and now with the hybrid, and it's been a battle, specifically in road courses for some reason. And that's usually been, like, my strong suit in qualifying. Like, I've had probably one of the worst years in qualifying that I've ever had, because we basically always make the fast six. Like, we're always within the first 5 or 6 cars. But this year we've been more in the realm of, like, 8th, 12th, 10th. And obviously that makes the races so much tougher. And when you maybe don't have that much of an advantage compared to the cars in front of you in the race, it just makes it that much harder to actually just make ground. Like, it does feel like the last few races before Mid-Ohio, it was like, you drive your ass off and you're like, P9. It's like, oh, they're very wearing races where you give it absolutely everything, and you're like, am I doing something wrong? What do we need? And this weekend, it just felt like we brought everything together, and we put the hybrid to the learning that we know of it, and we now have two things that we need to try and perfect, I would say, before a race, because more than performance, the hybrid is so sensitive to car balance. Or I would say, no, other way around. The car is so sensitive to the hybrid and what the hybrid like can be moved around with. Like, where are you regenning? Where are you deploying? How much is it? Like, it's got so much influence into the balance of the car, which is so easy to just like confuse yourself, I would say. So now you gotta tailor two completely different things, but they have to work together, because if they're not working together, you're gonna be like, where are we?
Yeah, I mean, that was generally the feedback that I feel like I got from a lot of guys after this weekend, was just the effect of the hybrid is broadly just, can you get the balance of the car to feel right and not end up, you lose focus on paying attention to that by just for a corner or two, and suddenly you're losing like, big parts of a second because you just didn't have it regenning the right way for that part of the track or whatever it was, because you're having to kind of set the car up for the hybrid to work a certain way. So that totally makes sense. I'm one last quick one on my side, which is, I'm just curious for you to chat a little bit about the impact of having Tony Kanaan around. I mean, it's hard to tell. It's kind of hard to tell from the outside, like what really his role is. It seems like it's kind of expanded over the course of the year a little bit from an outsider's perspective. So, I mean, obviously I know Tony, we all as drivers, you all get to know him over the years. What's he like to work with, inside the team, and kind of how do you see that, having progressed over this year and continuing going forward?
He's got a lot of passion for this. He's got a lot of passion, and I feel like I see a lot of like how a lot of the emotion that I also, not forcefully, but just naturally kind of have towards, just being in the race car and stuff like that. I feel like he was very similar to that. So I feel like we kind of understand each other in a way. But he's been more of I would say a bit of like an umbrella, because it's not just like for drivers. I think he's been a very special thing for a lot of the rookies that have driven the car this year, the six car. But he also understands a little bit about, how does the partner and sponsorships work? You've been in bigger race teams. How can we incorporate the best leadership that you've seen into, he knows the structure of everything, and I feel like he can help all of us kind of piece it together. So he's very incorporated with Gavin, I would say, and he's very in touch with Zach as well. With me, for example, we have more of a friendship, I would say. Like we are more of like, fellow competitors and friends, I would say, and not so much as like, hey, I'm your boss. He'll say that he's my boss, but I still treat him like he's a friend. So it's, that's what it's about. You want guys that you trust, and guys that ultimately are there to help you, and that's always, very special, and a very key feature, I would say, into the success to a lot of these teams is, you need people there that kind of know the way.
How are you feeling about the championship, Pato? You've got some great tracks for you coming up. I'm sure the fans are really excited about seeing you at some of these tracks. Do you feel at this point that you kind of look back and want some races back, and kind of think about some of the missed opportunities that you've had through the season, or do you kind of focus now on where you're at? Because I mean, I say it in that context because you're third in the championship, even after some things, not going your way, or little things going wrong through the start of the year, and you're still third, and you have just as good a chance as Dixon. Basically, you're closer to Pato than he is now. So I guess I'm just interested in how you feel about the championship as a whole, and where you're at now.
Yeah, what can I say? The championship has been unexpected. I don't know how to explain it, because started great in St. Pete. St. Pete was good. And then Thermal, Long Beach, Barber were just like a blur of they were crap. Like they were horrible for us. They really were. They were basically 3 DNFs. Thankfully, one of them doesn't count, which was Thermal. But all the other ones, the Long Beach and Barber, they really were unmaximized, and they were very hard weekends to swallow, because the problem is it's always a constant battle. Like, you want something so much, and then you have to like force yourself to basically like take it back, because then it's just so easy to go over the edge. And in the start of the month of May, I would say I don't have any regrets May onwards. I really feel like I absolutely maximized our races, specifically in, I think, some missed opportunities in certain qualifyings. But then in the race, you can't control what happens in the race. Like Detroit, we get caught up obviously in a massive pile up, which we kind of just like got stuck, went all the way to the back, somehow saved the top what were we, 7th?
Yeah, 7th.
Yeah, and then we go to Road America, and we're starting further up, and then we get caught up in a freaking chaos with the pole sitter in the second place, and then Joseph chunks out Herta, and then everything is blocked, and then you've got guys on your side. You have to go around, you have to go through the grass, you have to go all the way to the back. So like so many races where you're just like, I don't want to even make up positions in the start. Let me just like go through. And then Laguna was a tough race all around. I would say it was just a very difficult race to just make up ground for us. And then thankfully Mid-Ohio was like, okay, but I think there's some great tracks coming up. I've had some great success in Iowa in the past. I haven't had that great Toronto yet, so I kind of want to have. I'm approaching Toronto like how I did Mid-Ohio. Like I really just want to have a good race there. Like I want to, like, not even going into it like, oh, I need to win that race. No, I don't need to win that race, but like it'd be nice to feel like you can like fight for the podium at least. That'd be really cool, because I like the city, I really do. But I feel like I don't have those good Toronto memories yet, so I'm looking forward to trying to creating them. And then what is next? St. Louis. That's a good one. I love going to St. Louis. We've got Portland. I've got good memories from Portland. I feel like we've been strong there in the past. We've got Milwaukee, which I feel like Milwaukee's going to be a shot in the dark, I would say. I mean, the test that we had, the Penske's would be a 1, 2, 3 and would have lapped everybody from what we've experienced so far. So if we can bump that up a little bit and kind of take it to them, I think that could be a very strong weekend for us. And then Nashville. I tested at Nashville. I really liked it, to be honest with you. I really, really did. It's it reminds me of a Texas, just more deg, but it reminds me of a Texas, and it's quick. It was very enjoyable, to be honest. So I'm looking forward to that race, and it'll be new to a lot of guys, including me. So we'll see what we got, but I think there's some great opportunities coming.
Well, Pato, thanks for joining us. It was great to have you on the show again. And so many motorsport series have to pump in crowd noise, but you never have to worry about that when you're at the front of the pack. It was amazing to hear, even on the TV. It was amazing to hear when you made a pass or when you were moving forward, there was so much noise from the crowd. It was awesome to see. So congrats, and we hope you have a good second half of the season. We'll catch up with you soon.
Cheers, guys. Thank you very much.
We love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn, and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's grammarly.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Very relaxed Pato award, a very relieved Pato award to end that victory drought. I kind of like the fact that he's making so much about the fact that he hasn't won for 2 years on the road, and he's basically just expunged St. Pete from his memory, like it just didn't happen, and that it wasn't a race win, which I guess it wasn't, but he got the points for it. I'm sure there's drivers out there who would be kind of correcting people for saying that he hadn't won a race in 2 years and saying that he'd won it at St. Pete. But I like Pato's strategy of not really counting that and just kind of working backwards to Iowa in 2022. JR, you obviously got to speak to Pato there. What was your kind of overall feeling from that interview and kind of where he's at the moment? Because I guess we could talk about this all day. We'll try not to, but it's been just such a roller coaster season for him and the McLaren team. And you put the context of McLaren not winning a race last year, and also the amount of investment and funding that goes into this team and the amount of worldwide attention that there is in motorsport on McLaren as a brand. You expect them to get better and better every year and expect them to be competing with the Penske's and the Ganassis. But as for the reasons Pato's explained there, it's not quite happened for them this season or last, obviously. And I guess there's been errors on his behalf, but there's also been some drives where I feel like other drivers wouldn't have got out what he was able to pull out of the car at times, and it's just been a really roller coaster season. I'm kind of interested in what your vibe was from the interview there.
Yeah, I guess I had a couple of things that stood out to me during the interview, and just obviously we have the benefit of talking to him live and like seeing his body language too, which you don't always get from the interview itself. But one, I guess, is just that he seems footloose and fancy free, kind of like he sort of just seems relaxed, and he often seems that way to me. I mean, I think he maybe to the point of sometimes seeming overly maybe blasé about, not to me, but just I think he can come across that way sometimes to folks, like things that seem like they're super serious, or we're talking about championships and whatever, and he's kind of like, well, yeah, I'm just we just had the last weekend. I don't really know how the next weekend's going to go, so we're just going to show up and we're going to do our best when I get there, and I'm trying to kick everyone's ass and whatever. And at times that can feel a little bit like, are you like, is your head in the game enough here? But I think to me, it's really, it sounds a lot the same as like when you talk to Alex Palou, that he's just kind of, he's just sort of relaxed about it. It's not the way that everybody is. It's not the way that everybody would approach a championship. It's not the successful strategy for everybody. But I feel like with a guy like Pato, you kind of got to just let him do his thing, and you got to let him do it his way, because that's how he's producing these kinds of results. And you see, I mean, I think Indianapolis is the perfect example, this year, many years over the past few years, when you really do get the lights shining at their brightest, he does often execute at his highest level in those moments. So I'm sort of willing to, I'm definitely willing to give him the benefit of the doubt that, him not being in the championship hunt, or him kind of not being able to manifest that within this team, may just be indicative of the fact. He even pointed out, it was interesting to listen to him talk about just this idea that he feels like they're often showing up at the racetrack to beat the 10 crew, or to beat whatever, to beat Newgarden on his day, or whatever that is, that, they're having to like do the impossible. They're having to really punch above their weight, go extract something out of the car that's just not easy to do. And then you have a weekend like this at Mid-Ohio where it doesn't feel that way. He's still having to execute at this maximum level to be able to end up on the top step of the podium. But that you got the sense for, as I'm sure you could, as the listeners would be able to hear from listening to him, you could definitely sense it in his body language that, it was kind of like they just rolled off the truck and it was almost like a sanity check. Like, oh, okay, it is possible for the car just to be good enough that I know that I'm not having to overreach to be able to stick the thing on the front row and be in contention for the race win. And it really just came down to him and Alex. Like there was nobody else that was even in the picture. So that I think is also worth pointing out here, that if you remove Alex Palou from this situation, we're talking about Pato. We're just crushing everybody and running away with an event. So it's interesting. Obviously, when there's so many things from the outside that you can pick apart, and then when you hear a guy just talk about it in such a matter-of-fact way in terms of the way that their season is going, it brings my perspective on Pato's season like back down to earth by a notch. I think that's just like maybe they're just not quite in that window. And we heard from Gavin O'Ward at the beginning of the season prior to the first race, I think, that he still felt like there were some areas where they just have some catching up to do. And it's not necessarily because they don't have the money to throw at it or whatever, but there's just IndyCar specific resources that Penske and Ganassi have had for a decade or more that are just hard to you sort of. It was interesting talking, even reflecting on that conversation with Gavin, that you got this sense that it was like, oh, this is to be good in IndyCar in the same, like it doesn't work the same way as being good in F1, kind of, that it's like there's just these different types of things because it's fundamentally a different type of thing that you have to be able to be good at. The rules are different. You're not a constructor that's can bring new aero updates every weekend, and so yeah, it was cool to hear Pato just kind of talk through a little bit of that. And it'd be really interesting if we had more time. It would have been interesting to pick his brain a little bit about Nashville and some of these places that they've gone and tested out, but definitely made me interested to see those events unfold later in the year.
Don't worry, JR, we'll get him back before Nashville. We'll get Pato back and have a chat to him about what he felt at the test there. There's quite a few drivers at that test as well, so I'm sure we can grab a couple of other people before that test as well. I definitely plan to do that for the pod because obviously we've got so much to talk about for that race that we haven't really anticipated yet, and that's a little while off, but we'll definitely reflect on that. Let's talk hybrid, JR. I know you've got some information that you can share about it. I guess I'll just rip off my immediate thoughts, which was that it was like a nice, intriguing aspect to the race. It did offer something a little bit different. I wonder if, like, in a year's time at Mid-Ohio, that it would be the same kind of level of interest and level of intrigue, just because we'll be like a year into it, and you can't really. I know they have these like lights on the leaderboard telling you when the driver's deploying and regenerating, but apart from that, it's kind of quite hard to see it in action. And we didn't really necessarily get, how can I word this correctly? It's like we know the drivers are all doing different things on track and they admitted to doing different things on track, but you don't necessarily always see that from a viewer's perspective. And the lap time might be exactly the same, even though the two drivers are doing two totally different things. So it's kind of hard to digest as a fan, as a thing, like what am I looking at here, and how is one driver using it better than the other one? It wasn't helped by, in the post-race press conference, I asked Scott McLaughlin and Alex Palou how much they were using automatic regen and how much they were using manual regen through the lap. And there was like an awkward silence for like 10 seconds. And Scott just went, "You got any more questions, Jack? I'm not telling you that." And Alex was a bit more forthcoming. He said he was using both. So we know Alex Palou's using some element of manual regen and some element of automatic regen. But I quite like that I didn't like not getting an answer, but I like to know that there's differences between the teams, that they're trying different things. Palou said he could see when Pato was using his regen and when he was deploying, and that he was trying to use it in different areas of the track to try and gain an advantage, even though that didn't manifest in in a way that allowed him to pass Pato in the closing stages or anything like that. There was at least some sort of effort there behind the scenes going on. I think the bigger thing we've seen, and I'm sure you're going to talk about this a lot more than I will, but just how the hybrid has impacted the balance of the car and how it's almost created a distraction for teams who are maybe looking at how to maximize using this hybrid unit, but have maybe taken their eye off the ball a little bit with the setup, or they just haven't quite nailed the setup in predicting what the hybrid was going to be like when it was installed, and how its use might affect the balance of the car across a race distance, or not even necessarily over just one lap, like over a whole race, and how it might impact. So I thought that was quite interesting. We did get to see the car being refired from inside, which I was very excited about last week. If you listened to last week's episode, we saw Romain Grosjean in the last 3 laps refire his car after a spin. I thought that was really significant, because if that was a caution, like, it could have either ended the race, or we could have had Palou was close enough that he didn't really need a caution to be able to like pass Pato, but you never know. Like if there had been a caution and Pato would have got a jump on the restart or something, you never know what might have happened there. And I just think it's really interesting that one race ago, if that had happened, then that would have been a caution and the end of the race could have been totally different, but it wasn't in this scenario. I think you said on the pod last week it's maybe going to make IndyCar think that they should have like developed this technology like 10 years ago, and I totally have that feeling after this race. But
how hard can
at least
it be
got it now.
That's
the positive
thing. Like,
I know. We have to look at the positive side of it. And the only other thing was, we talked a lot about this, maybe not in last week's episode, but in the build-up to, on many occasions, discussing the hybrid, just in general, what the impact of bringing it in mid-season might be. And there was kind of 2 arms to this. The one arm was that the 27 cars that started the race finished the race, and they were all working at the end. But the other side to that was that Scott Dixon wasn't able to start the race and was a number of laps down immediately because of a problem that they'd not had in testing over 31,000 miles of testing. It was pretty much from what we can tell so far, it's being investigated, but from what we can tell so far, it's not an issue that's been had before by anyone. So, and that's dropped him from being, just over 30 points behind Alex Palou to being, well over 70 now and 4th in the championship behind Pato O'Ward. So an incredible kind of turn of events there, where you feel like you have to celebrate the fact that we got 27 cars at the end of this race, knowing what this hybrid unit has gone through over the course of its life and its various instances, but also feeling quite sorry for Dixon and, not hoping that any of the other championship contenders also have problems, but you kind of have to have balance, and it's really not fair that this happened to Dixon. And you can make a million arguments about this. I mean, you can argue any part could have broken on Dixon's car, and that's how motorsport is, but it was the hybrid part that broke. So it's kind of like it's kind of difficult to kind of comprehend that in a championship context, knowing that this has been that there's been an active choice here to introduce this in the middle of the season. So a really interesting kind of 50-50 balance there of the success of the hybrid being introduced. JR, you've been talking to some of your contacts and stuff in the paddock, and I think you've spoken to a few drivers and stuff as well. What was the kind of vibe that you got, and what were the kind of biggest takeaways for you from Mid-Ohio for the hybrid?
Yeah, I guess I think that the biggest takeaways basically were just the dominant sort of story that I got from everybody was basically just how, and this is on the back of testing for a long time and all that kind of stuff too, but it struck me that even there were a lot of teams that came into the weekend with sort of a theory in their mind of how the hybrid deployment was going to work that even still, was relatively rapidly iterated upon heading into qualifying and then going into the race, just getting in the flow of a race weekend and kind of seeing what other people are doing live as it's actually happening. And so I thought that was just kind of interesting, that despite the fact that there's so much practice, so much testing that had been done, that even some of the teams that were doing a lot of the testing were making, were sort of realizing that maybe there was a slightly better way of approaching certain aspects of the regen and deployment and all this kind of stuff. I mean, the things that really stood out were definitely that I was very actively just paying attention to the onboards when they'd show them, just to kind of see. And to your point, I wish that I felt like, just to be totally frank, I thought that the graphics that were associated with like seeing when everybody's regenning and deploying was kind of useless to me. Like that wasn't helpful because you don't really know where anybody's at on track, and it's kind of just this mess of red and green going on. Seeing the battery like icon sort of build up and be deployed is, one they would be focusing on a single car would at least kind of give you a heads up in terms of how that process was working. The thing that I guess I thought was interesting was you could really tell throughout the race that this goes to just some of the feedback that we had gotten and that you spoke to on the pre-event pod, that it's like you have to, it's almost this, you think about, okay, I've got this, I'm able to regen so that I can deploy energy. You'd think that the main gain from all of that is this ability to deploy. And so you're trying to be most efficient building up regenning so that you can deploy as frequently as possible to kind of get that win. Because I think it's also worth zooming out a little bit here and kind of recognizing that the regen itself is not a performance advantage. The fact that the hybrid unit is in the car is a fairly significant disadvantage from a performance perspective, just because it adds weight. And so the only thing that helps claw any of that back is the fact that you can deploy. And so sort of stands to reason that the initial thinking here would be, how can I gain the maximum advantage of deploying, and getting the most use out of that? Typically speaking, that would be, can you deploy for like a second or two basically out of every corner? Like that's the added initial acceleration out of a corner is where you gain the most advantage from push to pass. From like, if you just watched, so if we kind of think about this in another context, think about it just as push to pass, without the regen part of it or whatever else. If you were just trying to maximize like 10 seconds or 15 seconds worth of push to pass in a lap, so you see guys doing this on in and out laps in particular, you'll just get on it for like a second and a half out of every corner, basically. Like that, ends up being the best sort of bang for your buck. Mm-hmm. But I thought it was interesting that you didn't necessarily see that occurring. And I think that's for two reasons. One is it's hard to do in a lot of places on the track. And so as like a manual thing that you have to be constantly deploying, it's like, I think probably just a little bit difficult to make that happen. And so it ended up turning into more of a thing where it seemed like guys were basically using the whole infield section to regen, and that they had sort of mapped out more or less where they were going to be full, where the state of charge was going to be complete by just driving in a normal way using decel for regen throughout the infield, and then would like deploy some of it sort of coming to the start finish line, or maybe out of I think it's like turn 9 across the alt start finish line, basically. So they'd regen for a bunch of the infield lap because they'd come into turn 4 at the end of the back straight like with it completely used up. Then they'd regen for a bunch of that lap. They might need to deploy it a couple of times basically, and then they're trying to just have full state of charge again, basically, for, going onto the back straightaway. But I think the thing that's interesting about that is the reason that they're like ending up with that strategy, which is they're basically unloading the entire thing out of turn 2, out of the keyhole down the back straight, is that because they don't have a good opportunity to deploy any more of it, basically, until they get to another straightaway. So they have a whole bunch of corners that they have to get through before they're going to be able to meaningfully deploy it again. And they need to not get back to a full state of charge before they have a chance to deploy again, because that'll screw up the balance of the car, basically. And so all of this kind of comes back to mapping out where you're regenning, and well, you're going to just naturally regen by being off power. So it's like, where's the area on the track that you're going to probably get to full state of charge by just letting the thing do its thing more or less automatically, and then making sure that if there are corners that you need for if there are corners after it's going to get to its full state of charge, that you need to deploy some energy between those corners so that you can allow it to regen. Otherwise, your corner entry balance is like completely out the window for those corners, those places on the track. And so it's interesting just because it's full, and so you can't continue to regen. It's almost one of those things that it makes you wonder if somebody will figure out how to get it so it'll just apply that mechanical drag basically to the input shaft and it won't be regenning, like, because it'll already be full, but basically just to get rid of this concern, because it struck me watching it that it's like, I think the guys are basically just, yes, they're taking advantage of the deployment and that's kind of impacting lap time, but that a lot of how they're using it is just to make sure that it's not they're not somehow ending up with a full state of charge as they're having to break into a corner, and having that make for their, car balance in that corner being like totally out of whack. And so, yeah, it was really interesting just to watch it from that perspective. And to your point, I was bummed, and they've got a chance to do this more at other places, but I would have loved just for the NBC guys to have found like 2 or 3 different cars on different teams, follow some guys for a couple of laps just in the middle of the race, just to see if you could kind of get a sense of, oh, McLaughlin's sneaking in a little deployment here on this little short straight, or whatever, because I think those things were probably happening. And we just didn't really get a chance to see it with enough focus on that to like really, really pick that up. But I think that's going to be, I mean, that's what I'll be looking for at all of the rest of the races on the schedule. It's just kind of like, okay, this really comes down to lap, corner to corner. This is more about this is more about just hitting the target balance that you want to have. And that means that you need for the thing to either be set up to not be regenning into the corner at all, or to be always regenning into the corner. So anyway, I think it was definitely interesting to watch from that perspective. And it struck me that, I think this is kind of like probably not something that, anybody necessarily wants in the, notes about the hybrid powertrain, but it's sort of one of these things that even when F1 introduced hybrids, like, it did not make the cars go faster, and so I think that unfortunately that's maybe an expectation that people will have about this. The fact that the cars are not significantly slower because they're carrying around this extra, I mean, and that's the case because there is just nothing that's more energy dense and more fit for performance on a racetrack than an internal combustion, a high performance internal combustion engine. Basically, like, if you said, okay, the hybrid powertrain weighs 100 pounds, there are ways that you could distribute that 100 pounds by more engine displacement, or like if you gave the engines another 0.2 of a liter or something, that would not add another 100 pounds, and you'd more than offset any of the deployment advantage that you get out of the hybrid. So I think like that's just not the right way to look at this. Basically, this is a piece of technology that the fact that it is actually that the cars were as competitively fast compared to previous years as they were is actually pretty incredible. Like, that means that really does mean that this specific hybrid system, supercapacitor that Honda and Chevy have built together, is actually extraordinarily efficient from a power to weight ratio point of view, and all of those things, that the car wasn't just immediately like a second slower because it's carrying an extra 100 pounds around on it. There were some things that I thought were interesting, that because I was starting to think, like, if you wanted to regen more, like if you wanted to deploy more, so you needed to regen more, the only way to do that really is by extending the amount of time that you're regenning. And that sort of struck me while I was watching the race. Like, I think this is basically like, if you wanted to do that, then you sort of treat it like lift and coast, like you would saving fuel. So that'll be something, I think, when we get to different tracks that have more opportunities. Mid-Ohio is just a place, basically, once you get to turn 4 all the way to like turn 13, there's just no straightaway, more or less. Like, there's nowhere for you to meaningfully deploy. We'll go to other places where there'll be more opportunities to deploy in between. And so you can get more advantage out of having regened more efficiently, basically. That's kind of an area where you got to kind of sit there and go, okay, well, here's another place. Here's another thing that Scott Dixon might just be able to do better than everybody else, So interesting overall to see it affect the race. There were some elements of kind of gaining performance back, particularly with the tire that's harder, that, it sort of seemed like maintaining pace over the course of a stint, that there was, some thought that maybe the hybrid system was enabling that to happen a little easier than it might have been without that, despite, carrying around the extra weight. It's hard to know how much of that, to your point, is just like, we're just on a harder tire, so maybe that's just naturally going to be the case. But yeah, definitely just an interesting thing to continue to see how teams use it and how that evolves.
It's also, I know it's not been designed this way, but it's also fascinating to me that they've managed to debut it at a track where it's been resurfaced, so you don't have a perfect back-to-back of times and that kind of thing.
And then we're going to Iowa where they've changed it too.
And then we go to Toronto, which was wet last year for a large part of it, and we had the rubber off of the race. So I feel like Portland's probably going to be the first realistic chance where we get to back-to-back a bit.
It's a good point.
It's quite interesting that Toronto and Portland are down as TBDs on the rules list for the amount of deployment per lap. So it feels like almost that let's call an apple an apple. The deployment maximum is being done to protect the units for the rest of the season, and to make sure that these units are reusable and that they continue through the year, and that they're, even through a weekend, that they're reliable. So IndyCar will have the maximum amount of deployment that they feel is possible without causing reliability issues and stuff like that. So that's probably the reason why Toronto and Portland especially are down as TBDs. Probably wanted to get Mid-Ohio out of the way and learn how the unit worked and get some more kind of like active on-track data. But it's still just fascinating to me that they've managed to introduce this at like the perfect time for not being able to decide kind of like how impactful it's been in terms of, as you mentioned, adding the weight and slowing the cars down, and they've got the opportunity to like crank up the boost for the for the other road courses. So and Toronto being a street course, so that'll be really interesting to see. There's a couple of bits I just want to wrap up before we finish. I mean, I feel like we rounded up the race with kind of how Pato and Polo kind of got on. If you're interested in Polo's pit stop, I can explain kind of what happened there. It was basically the driver can't engage first gear while fuel's going into the car, and basically Polo just pulled the gear while fuel was still going in. He then was like dropped off the jacks and thought he was in first gear but wasn't, so then he had to look down at the steering wheel, find first, and then pull off. So that's where he kind of lost those 1 or 2 seconds that allowed Pato through. Definitely want to kind of just briefly mention a couple of like interesting stories from the race. Christian Rasmussen was a big one for me. Obviously, the reigning Indy Next champion was able to finish 9th. He qualified 9th. Pretty low-key race, but on a weekend where his teammate, Rinus VeeKay, seems to struggle so much. Obviously, a race winner in the series, and someone who's been talked about in the context of silly season. I was super impressed with how Christian Rasmussen got on. And at some point, I feel like we'll do, over the Olympic gap, I think we'll do an episode on the rookies and how they've got on this year, because they've all got such fascinating stories of how they've ended up where they are. And there's just so much going on behind the scenes in terms of the results of a lot of the rookies. We mentioned Linus Lundqvist when we had him on the show quite extensively, but I definitely feel like some of the other rookies have got some interesting stories to tell, and Christian Rasmussen, who starred at the Indy 500, is definitely one of those. And Toby Sowery was the other one, who finished 13th. He'd only tested in IndyCar at Sebring last year. That was the only time he'd tested. That was with Rahal, but he's the latest driver to be called up at Dale Coyne to have a crack at that one. And yeah, he finished 13th from starting. I think he was 24th on the grid he started, so worked his way up really well. One of the reasons he was able to do that, before I tick off another couple of boxes, was because a lot of people decided to do a 3-stop, which, JR, can you shed any sort of light on why anyone tries a 3-stop in the Mid-Ohio race? Because I've seen it work, I think, once. I remember Will Power doing it in maybe 21 or 20. I'm pretty sure it was 21. But there was loads of caution laps there, or at least a significant amount of caution laps that made the strategy work. Knowing that I guess knowing how the race was playing out, it didn't look like there was going to be a load of cautions at the start there when people started diving in for that 3-stop. And I feel like, I know they weren't going for the race win at that point, because they were, all of the people who tried it were already so far behind at that point of the race to Polo that it just wasn't going to be a race winning strategy. They were already almost a pit stop behind anyway at that point. But yeah, can you make any sense of this strategy. I know Newgarden probably would have made it work if he didn't have his mistake where he hit the curb and kind of went off, and then he had three pit lane penalties after that. It was 2 speed violations and a failure to follow the direction of IndyCar in that all in that one period there. So that was crazy. He had a drive-through, 2 drive-throughs and a stop-go in that period. So that wiped his race out. That's why he was 25th, if you're kind of wondering what had happened to him. He looked like, to me, he was the only one who might actually like end up ahead of where he'd started that 3-stopper from, let's say, because everyone else either went backwards, or I think Felix Rosenqvist was roughly kind of like where he started, and he was the highest finishing 3-stopper.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just one of those things that you tried the 3-stopper for you're banking on a combination of like 3 different things. One, that you've got a lot of pace in hand and you're getting held up, so that's one reason to dive off on 3-stop. I think Newgarden kind of like qualifies more than maybe anybody else in that category.
Yeah.
2 is you might get lucky with a yellow, that since you're already at the back, it kind of opens up your pit windows later, and you can just unquestionably like haul ass to the end. And you kind of like, if you pit, stay on the lead lap, and then a yellow comes out, you kind of, if you were already at the back, then basically it absolves you of that extra pit stop right away. And so then, I don't know, you end up with like the ability to take advantage of everybody pitting in front of you at some point, and then, being off to the races. It's sort of low odds basically that those things happen.
I guess let me add this then as well, is that, I mean, this might be you can say that I'm mad for like introducing hindsight here, that this is some sort of hindsight thing, but I also think this is just kind of like, there's 2 strategies in the race, one of them's going to work one way, one of them's going to work the other. If you just stayed on the 2-stop, like, I'm pretty sure Santino was behind all of the guys who tried the 3-stopper at the earlier in the race, and if he wasn't, then one of that group was, in terms of like, you've got Santino, Toby Sauer, you mentioned earlier, is around that gap. They're all kind of around that kind of 10th window. So if you just don't do the 3-stop, then there's a good chance you're going to end up in that, just overtaking the guys who did the 3-stop. And there's kind of like history at this track that shows that it doesn't really work. So I guess I'm just kind of confused by it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing is just, the third thing in essence is just that if everybody stays on the 2-stop, Mid-Ohio is just a hard track to pass on. Yeah. And so I think that's kind of the reason that a lot of people bail off on it, is you're thinking, I'm just going to end up stuck here. So so I think it's where I think I'm going to end up stuck here, and I think I've got pace in hand. Those 2 things will usually make you like seriously consider a 3-stop at tracks like this. And then you're sort of hoping that the third thing falls into place, which is like, maybe I get a timely yellow, and it sort of reduces the fact that, I've lost this here. And like I said, I mean, I think if you started far enough back, then there's no reason to give that a whirl, or not to give that a whirl. I think in some respects, or that's certainly how a lot of the teams think about it. The opposing argument is, as long as you think there are some other cars that are going to try the silly strategy, then you end up like Santino and these other guys, that it's just like, I mean, I don't know how many times, I was looking back at, I don't know, some of my races from like 2017, and we were often, qualifying outside the top 12, but maybe not all the way at the back or something. And so you're kind of in this, middle ground. And we often aggressively just chose to try to 3-stop these kinds of races. And almost every time you end up just getting beat by a handful of cars that were like right behind you, or it ends up being a wash, because a few guys get in an accident, and then maybe there's a couple other guys on the 3-stop that you manage to get track position on them, but overall, the lot of you are losing track position over the course of the race to, cars that just like were the same pace, or occasionally even more mediocre in terms of race pace, but because they just stayed on a strategy that was more sensible, like, it ends up working out better. So I agree with you that it tends to be in these kinds of situations where it's not hard to make the 2-stop work, kind of an unlikely thing to make happen, but we will continue to see it forever. Guys will continue just doing this. Like, there's no question that people will continue taking the 3-stop in these situations.
I especially found it weird based on, well, like, Marcus Armstrong, for example, his team called him in, and he started on the hards, so he basically just did a short stint on the hards, and then I just don't.
Well, I think that's the other thing, that like if you really thought there was definitely some conjecture at the beginning of the race that like the red was not going to last very long, like they were graining up and whatever else. And so I guess that's the fourth thing to throw into the mix of like, if that had truly ended up being the case, then that's a good reason to three stop, because you kind of de-risk having to do this long red stint that a lot of times teams just don't know by the time you get to race day, because conditions are different or whatever. Like you really don't, you often won't know how the soft tire is going to last over the course of a stint. And so, but yeah, to your point, like there was a lot of guys that ended up on a strategy where that wasn't even what they, you to hedge your bets on that strategy, you're going into the race, then you'd start on the tire that you think is not going to be great, and then you'd get rid of it. And anyway, so yeah.
And you would be able to make an informed decision at the end of that 15 laps whether the red tire was going off for you, especially because if even if it's not necessarily going off for other people, if you're just going to find yourself doing 10 lap stints on the softs and it's not working for you, then you need to get off it quick, right? So I don't know. Very unusual for me, but I'm not a race strategist and I can look back on these races with a great deal of hindsight, so it's great for me. A couple of other people I wanted to mention, specifically David Malukas, another interesting race for him. I feel like we can't really go through the pod without mentioning that he qualified third on his second race back from his crazy hand injury after managing to do the whole Laguna Seca race. I don't know if comfortably would be the right word, but he got to the end and was able to like perform at a good level. And again here, a really interesting weekend where he qualified third, but unfortunately had a stall in his first pit. Up until that point, he was, it was hard to say where he was going to finish, but he was like on par pace-wise with everyone around him. And we've definitely seen Meyer Shank struggle with tyre life, over its time as a team, and we've seen Felix occasionally fall back through various issues and stuff like that. And there didn't seem to be any issues for David. He seemed to be holding pace quite happily before that issue. So it's a bit disappointing to see him finish 12th, but maybe a sign for his fans of things to come with that really strong qualifying performance. And we're going to Gateway soon, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of excitement for David heading into Gateway. I'm trying to think if there's anyone else we've missed out. Andretti was the other one I wanted to mention because they had a really strong race, finishing 4th, 5th and 8th with Marcus Ericsson qualifying a little bit better and being up in that fight and having a much needed top 5 after his difficult season that he's had so far. So yeah, definitely interested to see how all that played out. We have got Iowa coming up, so we'll take a quick break here and then we'll dive back into Iowa with a little bit of talk about repaving and obviously the hybrid making its oval debut as well. All right, JR, there's not too much time to reflect on Mid-Ohio because we've got to go straight into Iowa this weekend for a double header, traditional now in the IndyCar schedule. A bit of a curveball thrown in the mix here because not only is it the first race with hybrid on the oval, it's also been repaved, which is probably has Joseph Newgarden shaking in his boots a little bit after his dominance over the past few years at the oval. I'm kind of interested. It seems like the majority of the opinion surrounding the repave is that it's likely to kind of bring everyone a little bit closer together in terms of maybe Penske not being quite as dominant as they have been in the past. Obviously, whether that translates to that actually happening or not is another scenario. It might just be a bit of wishful thinking from the drivers. But I guess maybe give us a bit of a flavour of what you've seen so far and what maybe you think is going to happen. Because if you look at the repaving, it's obviously on the bottom of the racetrack, and that kind of tells me and tells fans that the bottom of the racetrack is going to be grippier and it's going to be even more difficult to kind of go around the outside. So I guess Pato Ward said this in the post Mid-Ohio kind of press conference that he was a bit concerned that maybe it was going to be a little bit difficult to overtake in places and that the race was basically going to look a bit different than in the past. So is that kind of what you're expecting from what you've seen so far?
I do think generally that's true. There's places where, it extends, I think, into the second lane a bit for parts of the corner, but that, the general essence of what I heard from the test is it's just faster. Like it's quite a bit faster. I mean, more than a second quicker in like qualifying pace, which on a, now down to a 17-second lap, like It's a big difference. And so part of that comes from basically just being able to be much more committed to throttle on the new pavement on the bottom. The bottom lane is the faster lane through the corner for one lap pace, just one way or the other, because it's shorter distance. You typically will get to a place during race running where, because you're lifting a lot and the second lane is a little bit more banked than the bottom lane. Iowa is one of these tracks. I think Homestead is the only other track that I can think of that is progressively banked. So as you go up the track, you do actually, all other things being equal, pavement not being any different, or whatever else, it is a little bit easy. It's basically less work on the car. So you're working either the right front or the right rear tire less by going up the track into the second lane. I think because of the fact that the bottom lane now is repaved and unquestionably is grippier, like I don't think there will be a circumstance in which that isn't the case. In terms of daytime, nighttime, sunny, hot, cold, whatever. I think it's just faster in all conditions. Part of it's going to be an interesting dynamic in that there were a number of crashes at the test that were basically, I think, just because the bottom lane has so much grip that then when so in order to maximize that grip, you've got to be super committed to really using it. You're carrying a lot of throttle down into the corner, like borderline probably flat in qualifying trim all the way around, which it hasn't been for a number of years now. That if you have something go wrong, get a little wiggle, or it starts to skate up the hill on you, there's just not much margin for error, and then you lose a lot of grip as you move up into the second lane, and then you're going to lose even more grip once you get out of the second lane, basically. And so, it's been a place in the past, I think, generally speaking, where on test days, I would put it this way, that it sort of takes until you get to a full field practice to really have the second lane start to come in anyway. So it's not something that you always tend to see on a test day unless it's in essence, a full field test day. So there's a little bit of it that I think is like wait and see to see, at some point the second lane will have to come into play. Basically, I just think there's no way for that not to occur, but that you're just going to have these really varied levels of grip starting from the bottom and moving its way up. So it's hard to know what that really means. Generally speaking, at particularly these types of tracks, when they get faster and you get closer to being able to get flat out, then you tend to see the field just become a little bit closer together. Like as the grip goes up, then generally that just makes it easier it makes it so that more setups can kind of work. And so for that reason alone, I think it's likely that you don't see, and the fact that we've got the hybrids, which, a lot of the feedback that I was getting through this past weekend and after the weekend was basically just that one of the biggest differences running the hybrid package through a full race weekend is that it does really affect the way that teams are thinking about their setups. And so even if you took out of the equation the regen and deployment of the hybrid and we're just considering it as like it's this extra weight that's at the back of the car, so that all by itself changes the way that you're going to set the car up, it's definitely possible that there's more of a shakeup than we've seen. We've seen Penske basically be dominant here for for a long time. I can't remember the last. We've had some other drivers have won races, besides Joseph Newgarden, besides Penske guys over the last 10 years here, but it's been almost that long now where they've been the dominant team. So it's definitely possible for somebody else to come in and then obviously the hybrid regen and deployment and the way that potentially factors in. We'd have no reason to say that Penske won't have that figured out just as well as anybody else. But in this early stage of this kind of new system, it's possible that somebody else may just have a slightly different philosophy about how they're going to, not necessarily how they're going to use those tools, but how they're going to bake the use of those tools and the effect that they have on the way that the car gets around the track over the course of a stint. There may still be some kind of macro differences in the way that, teams are kind of thinking about the hybrid just as a package, basically inclusive of how it changes the way the car handles and all these other things. So certainly more up in the air in terms of who's going to be good and how that's going to play out both in qualifying and over a race distance. I think it's also possible that those two things are more different from each other than they have been in the past, and definitely be interesting to see because we'll have a lot of track time too. So even just from race 1 to race 2, possible that we see some more significant like shifts in where people are at and why.
Our guest on the podcast, Pato Award, was the last non-Penske to win in 2022, but I think before that you have to go back to Hinch in 2018 with Schmidt-Peterson for the last non-Penske to win the race. So it kind of shows the dominance.
And I think that was only because Joseph they pitted Joseph for tires with like 5 to go or something. Like he was leading.
Yeah, he had that rear end failure, didn't he? That put him in the wall and almost kind of ruled him out of the next weekend as well. And he was in quite a bad way for a little while there. So yeah, that was an interesting few weeks for sure. I just think there's so many contrasting things to get into about Iowa that I'm so kind of excited about to see how they play out, because we've got less than half of the hybrid deployment per lap available at Iowa than we did at Mid-Ohio. So the deployment is 105 kilojoules per lap as opposed to 310 at Mid-Ohio. So there's quite a significant drop there. We've got, as you mentioned, the lap time so much quicker, there's so much more grip, but we've also got the added weight of the hybrid and, you know, the tire as well. I mean, the tire's been designed to not deg as much as it might have done if we'd have just used last year's tires, for example. But kind of fascinated that Mid-Ohio we didn't really see any tire deg basically at all. Like the guys were going just as fast as they were on their in laps to pit as they were like on their out laps to pit earlier. So there's so many different little things that we don't really know how they're gonna apply to Iowa here and how this might play out. I'm just quite excited about how the hybrid might play out as well, because I think it's going to be such a small benefit to whoever's kind of getting a gain out of this in this scenario on an oval, especially because we're talking about the lap being nearly flat in qualifying and a very small couple of lifts, I think, in the race. That's going to not provide much time for regeneration and building that battery up. But the people who do get to actually deploy and are actually successful at doing that properly are going to have a little bit of an advantage as well. So it's going to be super interesting to see. I've heard every kind of view from drivers as to, so like the opposite ends of the spectrum, basically. Some people saying the hybrid's not really going to make any difference here. It's not going to be as effective as, obviously it wasn't in Ohio for sure, that's obvious, but it's not going to be really effective at all. To, you know, people being quite excited about the opportunities. If you do get this right, then you will have a better advantage because it's going to be so difficult to regen. So it's going to be really exciting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, I think there's just a couple of things that I think are worth digging into. There are basically that I think that, in my opinion, the two things that are going to have the most significant factor when it comes to the hybrid unit, just like this being a race with the hybrid versus last year or something when it wasn't, is that, you know, probably the most significant factor is just going to be who has managed to sort out setting the car up properly just for the change in the car's weight and weight distribution, basically. Like, so that's the main thing that I think is going to factor in. The other part of it is, depending on, you know, you mentioned that the amount of energy that they'll have available to deploy is going to be less than this past weekend. But in some respects, like the way that they will be relying on it, I mean, teams most likely will be relying on the regen for the effect of like engine braking into the corner.
Yeah.
And so we get into the same thing that occurred here at Mid-Ohio, which is if you screw that up such that you haven't deployed enough energy, and so before you're intending to use the regen basically as a part of just the flow of slowing the car down into the corner, then there's like a high risk to just be a little out of whack on that and have that really affect your like corner entry, like the way the car handles basically down into the corner and where you're going to place it. Like if you kind of think about it just in terms of, you know, there's a lot of times on ovals like this where you're not actually dragging brake into the corner. You're basically letting the aero load and the engine braking slow the car down into the corner with a downshift.
Yeah.
So this will be that and then some, because you've got regen doing that. If the regen ends up being, it depends a little bit on how powerful that actually is, and the teams and drivers will have different settings. So it'll be possible for them to just be, if they don't think they're going to get a lot of value out of the deployment, then they could also be super conservative on how much regen they're using. And that maybe makes for more consistency in terms of what we're talking about here. But if you start to get more aggressive with the regen, and so it ends up becoming more of a factor for how the car is handling bending down into the corner, then you also start to run a higher risk that your state of charge is full, but like before you kind of want for it to be, basically. And so then you'll have the effect of like now suddenly not having that engine braking, that you're sort of at that point you'll be bending down into the corner anticipating that you've got that as a part of your kind of, I don't know, just corner entry line overall strategy, input strategy as you drive. So I think that'll definitely be something just to look out for. And it wasn't obvious to me that any of the accidents that happened on the test day were because guys somehow got out of whack on that. But it's something that when you think about, managing that and kind of figuring it out in practice when there's not a bunch of cars on track versus being in a race situation where the chips are all on the table and, you're trying to battle your way through traffic. Having, Iowa is super busy. Like it consumes a lot of bandwidth for drivers just to kind of get that right, get the timing of all of those things right. And so now you're throwing this pretty significant extra variable that may or may not, but has the potential to be this extra thing that you're having to pay attention to literally every corner of every lap. There's a lot to potentially unpack there from that point of view.
All right, JR, thanks for joining me. Another fascinating episode. Probably Johnny, editor, is going to hate us for going massively over our allotted time limit, but Johnny, I don't care. It was a good episode. And we had the race winner on with us as well, so you can't complain. We'll definitely be back with another episode very, very soon because we've got Iowa coming up this weekend. We'll be back on next week to obviously recap everything that happened there. So that's all for this episode of the Race IndyCar Podcast.
The Athletic.